All right, welcome everyone. Really nice to see everyone here today, especially our cohort and those of you who are joining us live via the streaming link on LinkedIn. So great to have so many fantastic panelists. So, we've talked in our past couple webinars about, fundraising and, the general climate in this space. And, seen, while there's some struggles this year, things are going, uphill. And so hopefully a lot of the companies in our cohort in particular are, making good progress on this and actually moving toward generating revenue themselves. So, that's as a company, that's, your goal at the end of the day is, how do you bring money in to continue sustaining your business operations and grow as a company into new products. So we've got a great panel set up today that can talk about, how you get to this stage from many different perspectives. So starting, with reimbursement and coding, what types of, CPT codes should you be looking for? To, big picture healthcare economics, how do you convince these hospitals systems to actually start using your device once that's on the market and available? And then finally, even when it is available, you need to set a price on it. What is this going to be? How can you justify this price for payers and for those stakeholders that are going to need to be convinced to adopt it? So really happy today to be joined by three fantastic panelists with much different backgrounds in this space. So we're joined by Jo Carroll Hyatt, who's the former VP of Health Economics and Patient Value at MDIC and the former chair of the National Product Council at Kaiser Permanente. We have Tamara Fuller-Rook, who is the principal of Health Policy and Reimbursement Strategies at MDIC. And then finally, Tom Patzelt, who's a principal at Patzelt Marketing, former vice president of marketing at Aaron Medical and former vice president of marketing at Med Robotics Corporation. So between the three of them, I think you'll get a really good lay of the land for, what MedTech reimbursement looks like, how to get there, and how to price effectively. So without further ado, I'll let our panelists introduce themselves and their backgrounds. Jo Carroll, let's start out with you if you want to give about a minute background about yourself.
Thanks. It'll be a little tricky in 1 minute because I've done a lot of different things. I trained in general surgery and started my career at Kaiser Permanente as a very busy clinical surgeon. And after about 15 years, moved into full-time administrative roles in the organization. And I spent another 20 years in KP. As Nicole said, was chair of our National Product Council at Kaiser Permanente, which makes all the decisions about what to purchase to take care of the members other than pharmaceuticals. And I also, and it was a wonderful fit, was chair of the Interregional New Technologies Committee, which is KP's internal evidence review technology assessment organization. And with the pandemic, I was clearly pure overhead and was furloughed and took a position with the MDIC for a couple of years, where it was terrific working with industry, FDA, CMS, and patient groups looking for value. It was a nice fit. I also spent 3 years as secretary of the board for HTAI, Health Technology Assessment International, and similar areas. So look forward to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo Carroll. That's great background. Tamara, what about you? You want to give a bit of your story?
Yeah, hi. I'm Tamara Rook. I am formerly I was VP of Global Health Economics, Reimbursement Policy, and Market Access at Zimmer Biomet. And similar to Jo Carroll's story, I'm right now an independent consultant, and I do work with MDIC. I don't work for MDIC, but I've been doing a number of consulting projects this year, which has been a lot of fun. But I've been in the market access medical device world for about 20 years. Prior to that, I was on the payer side, I was on the provider side, which gives me, I think, a nice, well-rounded approach to all things market access. But have worked with big companies, small companies, startups, etc. Excuse me, mostly in the elective space, so used to demonstrating medical necessity for life-enhancing technologies. And I have a real passion for accelerating patient access to new technology. So I'm happy to be here today. And thanks for asking me to be on the panel.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Really great background, and I think will be really nice, given all your experience working with payers and providers to see kind of, where they're coming in. So finally, we've got Tom Patzelt. And so Tom, is going to be bringing in some pricing and marketing input into this. So Tom, you want to give a bit of your background? Oh, sorry, Tom, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I'd say, first of all, I'm just really honored to be with the two other panelists on this and have such outstanding background in reimbursement and health economics. And I bring a somewhat different perspective, having worked for 30 plus years on the commercial side. And my roles have always focused on building and implementing strategies to drive market adoption. And I always contrast market adoption with, market access is sort of getting your hunting license and getting the ability to be successful. And sort of the adoption side is, hey, man, let's make sure that we're getting the repeat purchases that we're seeking to demonstrate to others. So in brief, I cut my teeth in strategic marketing roles with multinationals, including Medtronic and Merck. And then I moved to the startup world about 15 years ago. And in that time, I've been an executive in companies, in startups, and a consultant, and always working on developing and implementing go-to-market strategies for disruptive products. So I was very lucky, I'm on sort of good and bad outcomes with startups, but very fortunate to be at one with a very high, strong exit. And so today, my consulting business really focused on helping them startups with two things. One is gathering insights to figure out, who precisely is going to drive the purchase of your product and why. And then the second one is helping them to ensure that they've got the foundation and resources in place to, give someone at some point a chance to be successful selling the product. So excited to be here today and with the audience and looking to share whatever I can.
Thank you so much, Tom. And Tom, Joe Carroll, and Tamara have all been part of our MTI community. Tom, the shortest at just a month, but already has been a value workshop facilitator and now a value coach for some of our companies. And Tamara and Joe Carroll have been very involved in the value program over many years, including serving as mock panelists. So for our cohort, you might recognize them. You had one of the two of them in your workshops. So very lucky to have them all and get more of their advice and wisdom specifically on these topics in this. So let's start off with, some questions around, reimbursement pathways and codes. So, all of you guys have worked with different types of products. Maybe you can give a lay of the land of what types of reimbursement pathways you've worked with in general during your career. So Joe Carroll, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I went to Kaiser Permanente because I didn't want to have to think about this stuff. I was on a salary as a surgeon, and all of the members of Kaiser Permanente at that time, 100% of them, whatever was being paid for their coverage, whether it was through an employer or some other program, was done. And the patients had very little in the way of cost share. And it was appealing to me to be able to provide care without worrying about what the impact financially was going to be to any of the members. And we had already been paid at Kaiser Permanente for their care. So there wasn't any question about trying to pull in more revenue or charge for things that we might not feel were absolutely necessary. So that's my background. I'm kind of allergic to the idea of reimbursement. And in fact, I attempted consulting briefly when I was furloughed, and it just felt really uncomfortable to me. It was just so opposite my 36 years with KP that I couldn't do it. And hence I changed again. But what I can say is that model, the Kaiser Permanente model, and some of the things I've learned through that around adoption of technologies, demonstrating the evidence, persuading stakeholders, all of that is very relevant to this audience. And although the coding and reimbursement component isn't particularly an area that I can really help with, what I do want to say is that the KP model is applicable internationally far more than how the US healthcare system operates. And I recognize that the Sutton's Law, you go where the money is, which is the United States. But in terms of expanding internationally and getting adoption, many of the pathways that would be successful for KP would apply internationally. So Tamara?
Yeah, I can just add on to what Joe Carroll was saying. I first had the opportunity to meet Joe Carroll when I was working for a neurostimulation company that had a brand new, excuse me, high frequency neurostimulator for chronic pain. And so there's really two categories when you think about reimbursement pathways. There is an existing category. If you think about spinal cord stimulation for chronic pain, it's been around longer than I've been alive. And then you have disruption. You have therapies that are emerging, they're disruptive, they don't fit in a nice category that already exists. But the one thing I'll say to add on to Joe Carroll's comments is when we were launching or getting ready to launch that high frequency stimulator, even though it was very nicely fit into an existing reimbursement category, if you will, we still needed that adoption. And the reason that we were of interest at Kaiser Permanente was because we had physicians that wanted access to this new technology. And that really helped open the door to Kaiser. There was also a comparative RCT, so level 1 evidence that supported the use of this new technology. So when you think about, I know there's a lot of questions, but when you think about adoption and reimbursement pathways, you know, your physician, your KOLs, your study investigators, you know, those that really have the experience and know the outcomes of your technology and how it fits into, you know, an IDN like Kaiser. I mean, I think that really helped us put us in a really nice position. And Kaiser was one of the first contracts that we had. So that's how I got to meet Joe Carroll many years ago. But
that was a while ago, Tamara. A quick interjection, which is that the decisions about what to acquire, use in the care of the members are in the hands of the clinicians in Kaiser Permanente. And so one way to think about it, and it was a conversation I had with the members of my 87 teams that made these decisions, the decisions we're making are also for the care of ourselves and our families, because all the physicians and nurses and other staff are KP members. And it really is eating our own cooking in terms of the decisions that were made. And that was something that I think many of those in industry have a different perspective on why the decisions are made the way they are. But I appreciate Tamara's comment, because it was the physicians who thought, oh, this would be great for my daughter or for my mother or somebody in their family. So it's one thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, really interesting to hear KP's model on this. I had no idea. So that'll be great to see how that, you know, compares to the traditional reimbursement pathways. Tom, what about you? Specific reimbursement pathways you've worked with?
Well, you know, I've always sort of been, this is the kind of thing that I'd be running in parallel with my market access partners on. So, but that being said, you know, I guess the main thing I would just say to all of this is there's the complexity of ensuring that somebody at some point is going to be able to pay for it is high, and the value of doing this is you know, really it's indispensable to not do the landscape analysis unless you're 100% certain that you're going to fit into an existing code. And a lot of times, obviously, with disruptive products, they don't. So I guess that'd be my main advice on this one.
Yeah, it's really good advice for the cohort. And our cohort actually had one question submitted. And Tamara, maybe you can take this one. What are some strategies to find the optimal reimbursement codes for their service or product? And can you explain the difference between like a CPT code and a HCPCS code or things like that?
Yeah, I get these types of questions all the time. And I think if the attendees don't remember anything that I say, coding is important, but it's only one leg of the stool, if you will, from a market access perspective. Having a valid code is great, and you need it for your, for your users, for your facilities, if depending on where your technology is being used. But it's not everything. Remember, coverage, coding, payment. You need all three, and we'll talk about those today. But there are different types of codes. And it really, depending on what your technology is it an implantable device? Is it a diagnostic? It really depends on what your product is and where it's being used. So keep that in mind, because if you're a diagnostic, you might not be used in the inpatient setting. You might only be used in the physician office or OBL, as some refer to it. So I know it drives people crazy that I answer a question with "it depends," but the difference between a CPT code is used for a specific service or procedure, which also could be a diagnostic test. It's used by physicians, it's used by hospitals, used by ASCs or ambulatory surgery centers. A HCPCS code is always used by a facility. So you may or may not need one. Let's say you have an implantable device. You will need a HCPCS code. If you're lucky enough to have a new technology that gets approved for a transitional pass-through payment, you will get your own HCPCS code. That way, the facility can use that unique code when they submit a claim for reimbursement. So it gets a little weedy, if you will, but I would say, really depending on your technology, this is where, having a conversation with a coding consultant to really understand what your product is. I've talked to a couple of startups that can't clearly tell me what their product is. And so I would encourage everyone, make sure that and maybe it's still in development, and that could be why. But we really need to understand, is this a procedure? Is this a service? And if it's not, then is there a procedure or service that, say, the data from your product is used to provide? There's all different ways to get at this, if you will. And hopefully I answered the question between CPT and HCPCS. But don't think that you always need a HCPCS code. It really depends on where your product is being used. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Thanks, Tamara. And
Yeah.
good for them to consider everything in the big picture as well, beyond just these codes themselves. Tom, Joe, Carol, any other thoughts on this, and specifically maybe some advice on where to go about, finding the appropriate code for a product if, a CPT code does exist?
Well, one thing I would add is that because Kaiser Permanente doesn't care about it, they're not billing any entity to get paid for the device. They're just paying. So if you're in what looks like it'll be an extended process, it doesn't preclude, as long as it's FDA approved or can fall into a clinical trial setting, it doesn't preclude getting into the Kaiser Permanente environment. And I think that's some of what Tamara was perhaps able to do with the neurostimulation device. It wasn't really ready for prime time and selling to a typical Blue Cross kind of pathway. And one of the paths that might be really successful in a way to build confidence is if you're looking at locations for clinical trials, if there's enthusiasm within Kaiser Permanente to be a trial site, which they have a very sophisticated and experienced research crew, that is probably the fastest way to adoption within KP, assuming the trial, of course, is successful. But it certainly was how KP adopted the transaortic valve replacement technologies. They had both Medtronic and Gore as clinical trials in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And to this day, those sites use the one that they used in the trial at their location, even though it would really be nice if they could consolidate, but they don't. And so that's just something to keep in mind. If there's a possibility of having one or more trial sites within KP, that's a way to accelerate.
Oh, that's great to know. And just got another really relevant question in the chat from Olivia, who asked, what is the best claim filing approach for a HCPCS code on a direct-to-consumer business? Who should be filing that? Tamara, any advice for Olivier?
So yeah, I think this is where we get into the weeds quite often. I think your best case is always to have a medical specialty society submit a code application, because it shows that they have accepted your device, they want to advocate for your device or your product. You know, industry, anyone can submit a application, but they're, you know, the CPT panel is looking at who is also willing to advocate for the use of that code. So that would be, without knowing all the specifics, I mean, I think best case is, you know, having a medical specialty society submit. I think that just shows that it's not just industry pushing, it's, you know, the physicians who will be utilizing that product or device.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Along a similar vein, we got another question from Nikki, who asked, you know, how a certain device might be categorized into outpatient versus inpatient. They've been told that even if they have a device that's implanted, the patient stays in the hospital for a few days after, it might be billed as outpatient with days of observation. So who determines whether an implant procedure might be inpatient or outpatient? If either of you have advice?
I don't think you can go into outpatient status after 23 hours and 59 minutes. I think it becomes inpatient if it's longer than that. Tamara, do you know?
Yeah, I think it's really going to be up to the surgeon who is, you know, performing the procedure, if you will, and the hospital. So it's really up to them. And it sounds very unusual for a patient to stay in observation for multiple days. I'm not a hospital billing expert, but that doesn't seem quite right to me. But
I know that's the limit in California, and I'm pretty sure it's the limit in other states, because
yeah.
Kaiser Permanente has built what they call 2359 units,
yeah,
which are all but an ER, but they're not a hospital.
You know, if there's a medical reason that the patient needs to be inpatient versus outpatient, you know, that's really going to be up to the surgeon who's implanting the device. But, you know, the hospital's perspective is they want the patient to be in the safest setting of care. And depending on their age, depending on their comorbidities, depending on what kind of procedure it is, like something like deep brain stimulation, you know, when those leads are placed, I mean, that's a craniotomy. So those patients are inpatient. And that's on what Medicare calls their inpatient only. Those patients have to be admitted as an inpatient. So without knowing the specifics, it's hard to say, but I think, you know, in the clinical trials, how were the implants placed? And is the procedure safe enough to be performed in the outpatient setting or even the ambulatory surgery center setting? Like a total knee. You think about, excuse me, 5 years ago, that was inpatient only. And it's moved to the outpatient and now the ASC. because Medicare has identified that this is a safe enough procedure to be performed in the outpatient and ASC setting. So it's a process, but hard to answer that specific question without knowing the product.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hopefully that was helpful, Nikki. But hopefully, yeah, sounds like inpatient will likely be the case for your device. We had another cohort submitted question before the panel around, how do you organize a reimbursement claim team for a device company, especially specifically ones with direct-to-consumer models, but I guess for anyone, does it make sense to build the team internally, or is it better to outsource this to a third party? What have been your experiences with these two models?
I can start. I do have experience with this. I think that depending on, so what I think is being asked is, should you build a team that helps patients with prior authorizations, maybe appeal submissions, a claim team? I mean, I think that's the intent of the question. There's a lot of procedures and services that are medically, the medical necessity has to be clearly documented. So industry can help with education, with tools, and really support the patients that are being referred. And I think that my preference, me personally, I've always preferred to build those teams internally. So those individuals report ultimately to me or to someone on my team. But sometimes cost is a factor. And to get started, it's easier to outsource. But I would make sure if you do, that you get great data, that you get reports, that you have visibility, to make sure that all of those referrals, all of those authorizations that are coming in are successful. And if they're not, what are some of the roadblocks? Is a payer coming back saying this is investigational, experimental? And if that's the case, make sure you have a very clearly defined process for appeals, because you don't want patients and your referring physicians or surgeons to get, aggravated. So I think that's the question, but if not, maybe somebody could drop something in the chat just to clarify.
We can come back to this topic at the end during the cohort Q&A as well.
Sure.
So want to move on now to healthcare economics and value. So heard some really good advice about, how to work toward coding and getting this reimbursed, but, how do you get it adopted altogether? And so, Tom, as we know, ensuring reimbursement coverage and coding and payment is necessary, but insufficient for commercial success. So how might a company increase confidence that their stakeholders' specific value propositions for their customers are going to be compelling?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. This is a really great question. What I would say first and foremost is the buying processes have become far more complex than they used to be prior to the era of strict cost controls. And so, the era of, get a physician to champion your product and someone's going to pay for it. That was great. I loved working in that during my career, but it's so far different from where we are today. And it, so I think the things to keep in mind is the buyers are much more sophisticated than they used to be. And that's why healthcare economics has exploded on both the buyer and seller side. And, you have to recognize you got to be able to make the case that you are a net positive or at worst neutral when you look at an institution's budget. So that's kind of your table stakes for getting in. But then recognize that even within a hospital or whatever institution is buying, you've got to understand what each of the key stakeholders who are involved in that buying process, how they will be affected by the decision and how they will view it. And so we'd love to think that people are altruistic and think about their institution first. And let's get real, right? They're employees, okay? So a big question is, how's this going to affect my budget? How's this going to affect me? Am I going to have to work a lot more to do this. I mean, I'm just being honest that these are the types of things that you'll hear when you try to get in there. So I think what, sort of beyond kind of this institutional or specific provider level, you've got to get to the detail of actually doing interviews and talking to these stakeholders and making sure you understand how they view it, how it will impact them, so that you can be confident that your clinical, workflow or economic story in aggregate is appealing to them.
I love that idea, making sure to talk to these stakeholders first. I think that's one really great thing about our MTI community, as well as knowing other med device companies, startups specifically in this space that, might already have connections to different stakeholders, KOLs, things like that. And Tamara, you had also, brought up a good point as well about, finding outsourcing could be easier, but who do you outsource to? And so, for those in our cohort listening, make sure you utilize the innovator portal for asking the community about some of these things, recommendations for, folks that, teams that could help with reimbursement, things like that. That's what our community is here for. So really like the emphasis on that. Another question. So, there's many different payers in the US healthcare system, as we know. What are kind of the differences between some of these? And Joe Carroll, since, you've worked, with KP that has such a different model, do you feel like any one of these is more likely to adopt new innovations than another?
Well, I'm biased. I obviously think that in part because the barriers around needing codes, needing to be able to bill are lower for KP that don't necessarily exist. If it's something that has clear benefit, and I agree with what Tom said around what it could be workflow, it could be other things, KP will pay more for a technology or product or service that is bringing value in a different way because they're in it for the long haul. The members stick around. They don't have the churn that most payers have. And also going back to what I said earlier about the decisions are for the care of their physicians and staff as well. So if it's something that's going to bring value, even if the budget doesn't show it, they're going to go for it. And I'll use an example from pharma since it's a little bit easier. There are some asthma medications that are really quite expensive. Maybe the cost has come down. But if those medications will keep a child in school and not at home, pulling their parent off of work and all of that and out of the emergency room, that's going to be something that KP will make that investment and purchase for the care of that child. So it really is about figuring out the value rather than finding the budget offset.
It's really good to know. And yeah, interesting for these companies have to navigate all of these different, potential payers and what their priorities might be as well in this. And, there's so many other stakeholders in this process. We got a question, on LinkedIn, given the importance of collaboration between MedTech companies, clinicians, government bodies, professional societies, things like that. How would you suggest bridging this gap and fostering better cooperation moving forward, especially when regulatory changes upset the traditional power balance? So Tamara, you want to take that one?
Wow, that's a pretty loaded question. But I think I would really start with, I mean, there's a lot of stakeholders, obviously. And I think that, I always go back to, with a new technology, is there an unmet need that you're addressing? I think a lot of times we come up with a solution and then we try to find that need for that solution. And not that that's a bad thing, but it's not always clear. And I think if we struggle to find, what that unmet need is, it might be a longer road for your technology or your product. But I think if there is a clear unmet need that your product or service addresses, and you have the clinical evidence to support, you think about from a payer perspective, and Kaiser is a great example, but if you think about the rest of the payer community with Medicare, with all the big commercial payers, they're really looking at how does your product impact, what is the clinical outcome of your product? And that has to be clearly defined in your value proposition. And I know that's part of the work that MTI does. So if you can clearly articulate what the unmet need is and what the clinical outcome should be for your product, maybe there is a way for, we've just talked about health economics, which is important. But if, from a payer perspective, they're looking at the clinical, what's the medical need? What's the patient's clinical result? That's really what here in the United States, that's what we want to address first. It's great if your product offers cost savings or utilization savings or something along that line. But the clinical outcome is really what our US payers and what Medicare is looking for. Medicare uses the term reasonable and necessary, which some people find to be very nebulous, but it gives them the discretion to really look at what's the impact to the patient. Because that's really what we want. Joe Carroll talked about that with Kaiser. That's really what we want to demonstrate. So I don't know that I answered the question, but I think if all the companies that are participating, if you can have that clear unmet need, if you have a clear value for the clinical outcome of the patient, I think getting all the other stakeholders aligned will make the process, I hate to say easier, but easier than not having that information to educate commercial payers and Medicare on.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. That's really good insight, and I think plays well into the value workshop that we hold for the MTI companies, and realizing who all these stakeholders are in this process. But then how do you get to convincing whoever it is of this value? Where do you get this data from? So is there a particular place that you would recommend? And maybe we can put some links in the chat as well if you guys have specific recommendations on where do you get this type of data for your justification for a healthcare economics argument.
Yeah, if you can, there's different ways to collect the data. Claims data is often used. If let's say you have a completely disruptive procedure or technology, but you have clinical study sites that are willing to collect this type of data, that's another avenue. And with something new and disruptive, there may not be existing claims data to use. So there's different ways to find it and to collect it.
Joe Carroll, any other suggestions on this?
Well, I think it really depends a lot on what value you're trying to demonstrate. If it's workflow, that's a totally different question than if it's a clinical outcome. And one way to perhaps think about it, and I know especially small startups are not really able to access a lot of consulting help and everything else that they may need. And that's one of the wonderful things about MedTech Innovators is that it goes a long way toward filling that gap. But there are other avenues, at least, to think about where you're going. So when I was with KP, one of the volunteer things I did that was really fun was I worked with FDA's Payer Communication Task Force. It's now got a different acronym, but you can find it easily on the FDA website. In the pre-sub process, it's possible, working with FDA, to request communication with the volunteers that are on the panel of payers. And it includes CMS, although CMS, of course, has limited resources and also is constrained about what they feel they can and can't say that early in the process. But some of the payers are not very shy at all about saying, this is what we would need, especially if you're going to charge us more for this particular technology. And I would meet with the companies. I would first receive a quick summary of what they're working on, and almost always it was something that I thought was at least worth a conversation. And one of the side benefits was that if it really did look like it was going to be of value to the KP care model, I would ask some of the experts, clinical experts in my, because I had every specialty on my teams, to think about whether this might fit in. And several of those conversations turned into KP being a trial site. So that was another benefit. And FDA, for those of you that haven't yet been through their process, they have some extraordinary experts that are part of their review process. And I would listen very carefully, ask for their help. They want what you want, which is to get helpful technologies to clinical care as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Joe Carroll. Really good advice. And I put in the chat for everyone the FDA's article about connecting with payers via this payer communication task force. So really good suggestion that you guys should look into for that. So as you guys know, most of our companies are quite small. Everyone's wearing a bunch of hats at once, taking out the trash while, writing grant applications and everything in between. So, is it credible or a good idea to find one expert to lead HEOR, regulatory affairs, and clinical all at once? What company stage would it make sense to go to a full HEOR leader? So health economics and outcome research leader for those listening. Anyone have any thoughts on this?
I can start. I think that it is important to have someone focused on market access. And if that's a regulatory individual or a marketing individual, I understand. I've worked at startups, you have to wear many hats, as you said, Nicole, but it needs to be on your early radar. And what I have seen at big companies and small companies is the assumption is made that once we get through that FDA hurdle, we're good. We don't have to do anything else because CMS is going to pay. And I see Tom shaking his head, so he's in my camp. But don't ever make that assumption, because when you realize, oh, hey, when I look at my patient population, it's 75% Medicare. We need to go talk to CMS, but oh, we're going to launch in 6 months. You're behind. And so it is impossible. As good as many market access professionals are in the space, we're not magicians. So I would say as early as possible, there's some great consultants. If you don't want to hire someone full time, maybe you have a fractional person, maybe you have someone who's an advisor like me to come in and give you an assessment. There are other people that do the same thing. Big consulting firms, one-man shops like me. Depends on what the needs of your organization is, but don't ignore market access, because I heard someone say once, a former medical director, the regulatory approval is required, but is inadequate. So anyway, Tom, you look like you want to chime in, so I'll give you the floor.
This is a great segue actually into our next section. So I think Tom can talk a lot about, this and how adoption actually happens. So, assume you've got reimbursement, you've got, market access. What would a startup consider when determining the appropriate price for their product? Are there benchmarks that they can use? Things like that.
Yeah. Well, as I get into this, I have to comment a little bit on what Tamara just said. Again, I feel great empathy for today's founders, because it used to be the case that you could kind of roll in that way where you're saying, hey, look, if I've got clinical value and if I believe that I can convince people of that, everything else will fall into place. And the reality is you cannot make that assumption, and people keep going to market. And I've experienced it with the companies where I've been the person holding the bag, trying to sell something or, advising somebody. And to think that you're going to do this stuff in some compressed timeline after you get regulatory, it makes no sense. So, my 2 cents on that last question is, how long do you want to invest your time and your money in your life on something before you're confident that it is even a thing? I guess for me, I want to be confident as early as I can, and so getting expertise, whether you hire someone or not, getting that expertise involved early is important. I think once you get to the executional stage, you have to have somebody, right? Once you know for sure you're deep in that process, you got to have somebody to drive the execution. But I wouldn't be shy about getting experts. So sorry, thank you for indulging my comments on that, Nicole.
Good, thanks.
Great passion point. Regarding pricing, pricing's really complex. I mean, everybody will tell you pricing is sort of grounded in science, but there's a lot of art to it as well. And there's so many different factors to consider pricing anything. But in our space, so let's talk about a little bit, obviously a lot of the work that Tamara and Joe Carroll do around trying to do these quantitative analyses around health economics. Those are important because they set the boundaries, right? So you start to say, okay, I've got to operate within these boundaries, but there's usually still a lot of uncertainty, so you say, this looks like it would be a good deal for the customer, but I also want to price it. I don't want to leave money on the table, and pricing is one of those things that drops right to the bottom line. So pricing too low is one of the worst mistakes you can make. And I've also seen in pricing, it's one of those flashpoint things where everybody's got an opinion in the company, the board, the executive team, everybody's got an opinion. It's almost always passionate. It almost always ends up in pretty emotional conflict. And so the more you can do to sort of frame this and inform it, say, look, here's what we know quantitatively. Here's what we know from talking to the people and looking at competitive companies and what sort of similar products can charge. A lot of times, keep in mind, you may be selling a product that comes in under one DRG, so you don't have new incremental reimbursement. So then the question is, well, how much will they tolerate, taking margin out of their DRG? And it's a squishy question. It's got to be informed by talking with people and looking at the market. But again, the science and the art are both important, and having somebody kind of lead that process will help reduce the tension within the org.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That really ties together, this value to, how do you justify it and set this price? So Joe Carroll, how do you navigate building a pricing strategy or revenue model around customers that use different reimbursement models? So for example, is it better to narrow your initial target market to customers that use a particular reimbursement method like fee for service within a particular customer segment?
I'm going to totally duck that one, Nicole. It's an area I not only don't know anything about it, but what little I do know is probably very dangerous. I'm going to go down just a small rabbit hole, because one of the things we haven't talked about in approaching various stakeholders and trying to get interest and adoption is think carefully about what are the other unintended consequences, or perhaps unintended, of the outcomes you anticipate. So for example, if there's a significant shift in site of care because of your technology, and it's now going to move to an office setting from a hospital, now you've got a significant hit to reimbursement and revenue for that hospital. The whatever surgery center or office or whatever is now going to benefit, but there are going to be others that are hurt. So think about who is potentially going to lose somewhere, whether it's a job or revenue or something else. That's an important part of thinking about how you're going to tell your value story.
Yeah, that's really.
I know I totally ducked your question.
That's okay. Tamara looks ready.
I can add, I think, just to add on to what Tom and Joe Carroll mentioned, if your technology is in an existing payment category, when you are evaluating where your price should be, you have to take into consideration, let's say, what the hospital or the surgery center or even the physician is going to be paid. It goes, or what they're going to be paid by Medicare, because the Medicare fee schedules, which are all publicly available, that's our benchmark. Now, commercial payers are going to, kind of bob and weave around those schedules, but that's the benchmark to use. And Medicare uses geographic adjustments. Here, where I am in Denver, Colorado, our geographic adjustment's about 1.0. Because the cost of doing business or providing care from Medicare's perspective is we're right at the national average. You go somewhere like San Francisco or Los Angeles, where Joe Carroll is, and it's about 1.5, 1.75. So they adjust those fee schedules. But if your price is so much higher than what the average Medicare payment is, you're going to really have to have a value proposition on, is there savings? If the hospital is your economic buyer, which often they are, you will have to justify why that price is higher. And there are different avenues to take. If your product might qualify for a new technology add-on payment, if it's used in the inpatient setting, or a transitional pass-through payment if it's in the outpatient setting. Those are things to keep in mind as well. But I would always look at average reimbursement rates when you are doing your pricing analysis, because you want to make sure you don't want to go too low. Obviously, this is the science or the art part of it, because it's hard to go up, as everyone knows. But I think just having all that data as you're completing your pricing analysis is really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Understanding all these potential avenues, add-on payments, things like that. So, at the end of the day, Tom, who is responsible for approving and signing purchase orders for medical devices? Can you give some examples of why it's important to go deeper than just answering, what's in it for the hospital?
Yes, I'd say, well, one finished point on that last one is, in my experience, I know this sounds crazy, but most companies tend to price too low. So, they're sort of like, well, that seems like it, and again, if you're informed, then you can put it at the right number. So, and as Tamara said, much easier to go down in price, pretty much impossible to go up on it. Regarding your question on this, yeah. So what I kind of joke that no PO, no purchase order has ever been signed with the word hospital, right? Nobody just wrote hospital in there, right? There has to be an approver, and there's a whole series of approvers behind that. So the thing to keep in mind is there's a lot of different stakeholders in a hospital, and today a lot of different people can sort of say no, right? And if you can't get yes from all those members of the value analysis committee, or at least acquiesce, you're never even going to get a chance to sell it. But even if you do, then you still have a budget holder that has to look at it and say, yeah, that's a good deal, for me personally, and I will authorize this purchase. So I think, again, the biggest, if you take away nothing else from today's conversation, it's recognize that you have to understand the people involved in the purchase process and what their motivations and impact is from whatever it is you're selling to them.
Well, thanks, Tom. It's really good advice.
Yeah, Nicole, I'm sorry, Tamara, if I
No,
could
go ahead.
interject, my dream, which I never fully accomplished, I got close on a couple of contracts with KP, was I'll describe as kind of risk-based, where the company is taking a bit of a risk by saying, we'll basically ensure that these are the outcomes you're going to get. This is the value we think you're going to get. And if they're not achieved, you don't have to pay this higher price. But if we do meet those targets, then we get to not only recoup some money going back potentially, and you may or may not want to do that piece, but going forward, it's at a higher price point. And as as I say, if the value is there, I think many customers will find a way to pay it. But it's very hard to write those kinds of contracts, and I appreciate that.
Makes sense.
Yes, it is. Yes, it
Yeah.
is. I think that's the holy grail that a lot of the medical device industry wants to get at, but very difficult to administer. But the one thing I would say about hospitals and the value analysis committee, never lose sight of who your economic buyer is. And one of the organizations I worked for, they were so focused on surgeons. The surgeon does the referral. Yes, they do. And they are a very important stakeholder, but they don't write your check. They don't buy your product. And I think you have to keep both of those stakeholders in mind. And if you have a new disruptive product, or even if you have a new SKU, that hospital has to say yes, like Tom was saying. So never lose sight of that economic buyer. It could be like, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Where is your procedure being performed? Is it in a physician office? Is it outpatient hospital, inpatient hospital, ASC? There's all these different flavors. But always know who your economic buyer is and how are they going to get paid. Everyone in your organization needs to know that.
Yeah, really good summary of it, keeping these stakeholders at heart and, what they're going to be getting out of it at the end of the day. So we had one final pricing related question from LinkedIn I want to make sure we get to, which is, what's the best way to sort through the trade-offs of purchasing traditional pass-through, TPT, for example, pricing, cost to charge ratio, et cetera? Tom, you want to take that one?
Boy, I'm not sure. So for example, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know what that abbreviation means, TCET. I don't know what.
I don't know either.
I can take it. I can take
if
it.
you can take it, I'll let
Okay.
Tamara
That's
jump
okay.
on this one.
As my dad would say, that's a $5 question. I think if you back up, I think the question is about how do I set my pricing if I have a pass through, or was that the question, Nicole?
Yeah, purchasing traditional pass through. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a completely clear question, but I would say this. In order to be successful with getting a payment pass through, the whole purpose of those Medicare policies is to compensate hospitals for the cost of new technology. So you have to set your price first, and your price has to be high enough. Medicare has a very specific formula that has to be met in order to be successful with your pass-through payment application. So when you report your price to Medicare, it's got to be high enough. And those formulas are online, they're on the CMS website, they're difficult. So if that's the route that you want to go, get a consultant who can help you navigate how it works. If you are breakthrough technology, CMS gives you a little bit of a pass on meeting their requirements, but you still have to meet what they call their cost requirement. So your price has to be higher than average. And CMS has this formula, like I mentioned, that tells them, is your price high enough? So when you go to market, you have to go to market with that price. Now, can you discount? Can you offer rebates off that initial price? Yes, you can. But you don't want to fib to CMS. You want to make sure that when you submit your price, it's to the best of your knowledge. This is our list price. So that's a pretty complicated question, but I think that in order to get that status, you've got to demonstrate that you have a high enough. So Medicare, and I won't get into this because we only have 30 minutes, but the whole intention of Medicare in the United States is to compensate hospitals for their cost of providing care. So when you think about price and cost, they're two different things, but Medicare tries to calculate what the price, what the hospital's cost of doing business is. So it's just something to keep in mind. I think I'm straying from the question, so I'm
Yeah.
going to stop talking.
No, that's a great answer. And I hope whoever asked that on LinkedIn, that's helpful to them. So I'll end the public session with one more broad question, also from LinkedIn, but I think very relevant to MTI. So for tech companies developing groundbreaking technologies that challenge the current understanding of treatment for specific patient populations and are in the midst of extensive FDA approval processes, what strategies would you recommend for successfully navigating the complexities of the US market while ensuring maximum impact upon entry? So, Tom, you want to take that one maybe?
Wow, that was a mouthful.
It's like 7 questions.
Yeah, basically, how would you navigate the complexities of the US market while maximizing impact? I'm sure there's many
All right.
answers to
Well,
this.
I'll see if I can get us at least started on this one. So I think, and I am thinking a little bit too about some of our companies that are coming from outside the U.S. and coming into the U.S. market. You cannot overstate how complicated the U.S. market has gotten, and it truly, even in the last 5 years, it's just been insane. And so now you've got, it used to just be you're thinking about hospitals. Now you're thinking about IDNs. You're thinking about hospitals. You're thinking about ASCs. You're thinking about all these different providers. There's a multiplication of these number of pathways, and I guess I always anchor back to begin with the end in mind and try to envision your product is adopted. Who are the winners of your product being adopted from clinical perspective, workflow perspective, economic perspective? And if you think about that and sort of then work backwards and say, how can I craft something that's going to be appealing to each of them? That's sort of how you end up having, a lot of companies think about these swim lanes of here's regulatory as a completely independent thing. Here's reimbursement. Here's clinical, you know what I mean? And the reality is, at some point in time, a salesperson has to go and engage the healthcare system, and they're going to meet a bunch of different people, and they have to have a story that works for each of them. And so I think the sooner you can wrap your brain around that, the more you're going to be ensure that you're less likely to be surprised and ready for it.
Yeah.
So that's a start. I know it's complex, hopefully.
Joe Carroll, have anything to add on to that, navigating these complexities?
Well, I'll go back to the suggestion to work with the FDA, with the Payer Communication Task Force, because that does give you a sense quite early about what various stakeholders are going to be looking for.
I think the other thing I would add to that, Nicole, is know who your patient population is. And, a lot of times everyone says we need to go to Medicare right away. Now, you might have more of a commercial patient population. And here in the US, that would be patients under the age of 65. So really think about, who are you treating? Maybe it's 50-50. Maybe 50% of your patients you expect to be Medicare beneficiaries, and the other 50% are commercial or the younger patient population. And I think it's, maybe it's hard to figure that out in the very beginning, but based on the data in your clinical trials, get at least have at least a guide, so you know. And when you talk to payers, let's say you do work with the FDA and their payer task force, if they give you guidance, I would take it to heart, because this is what the commercial payers want to see. We don't always like their input, but if CMS or a commercial payer gives you guidance, I would always carefully consider it, even if you don't agree.
That's great note to end on. Consider their guidance and yes, of course, hear from all of your stakeholders as much as possible in this process. So with that, we'll end our public streamed portion of this and we'll transition into our cohort only Q&A. But thank you so much for everyone listening, and huge thank you to Tamara, Joe Carroll, and Tom for joining us for this portion, and hope to see those of you who tuned in next week on our panel on distribution decisions. So how to get products